In a live congressional hearing watched by 11 million people, Nancy Mace calls Jasmine Crockett a loudmouth Democrat and plays a doctored video to take her down. The smear hits hard until a hot mic catches Mace saying something far worse. Jasmine doesn't flinch. She presents the truth, flips the room, and ignites a movement without ever raising her voice. Within 48 hours, the nation erupts. A hashtag dominates every screen, and Nancy Mace disappears in silence. But in that moment, before the silence, before the storm, what did Jasmine say? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The moment Jasmine Crockett stepped into hearing room 226 of the Rayburn House office building, the air turned cold. Not in temperature, but in tension. The lights buzzed harshly overhead, and camera lenses tracked her like weapons locking on. CNN's red light blinked just beside her face. Across the panel, Nancy Mace sat in the center chair, fingers folded, wearing a smile too sharp to be sincere. Jasmine walked to the witness table with calm, deliberate steps, the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've been targeted before. But today, she wasn't just the target. She was the test. As she sat, her eyes flicked to the microphone. The volume had been lowered, not enough for anyone to admit it, but enough to make her sound faint on live TV. A quiet trick, but a familiar one. Her nameplate read, Representative. Jasmine Crockett, Texas 30, yet the stairs said troublemaker. On the screens above, bold headlines rolled, Race and Federal Spending. Bias in education budgets? Jasmine knew then, this wasn't a hearing. It was a trap dressed as protocol. Every camera was waiting. Every word she spoke would be clipped, twisted, weaponized. Mace tapped the gavel and leaned in. Congresswoman Crockett, you may begin. And please keep it brief. Polite on the surface, loaded beneath. Jasmine didn't flinch. She'd sat in rooms like this before, where the rules looked neutral, but the weapons were hidden in smiles. Not today. She adjusted the mic and breathed in slowly. They wanted her rattled. They wanted her loud. She'd give them something else. She had just begun to hit her stride. Jasmine Crockett had her notes arranged, her facts sharp, her voice even. Her tone was calm, professional, but each word was edged with quiet urgency, the kind that couldn't be faked. In fiscal year 2023, she began, eyes scanning the committee, we saw a 23.4% decrease in federal funding to school districts where the student population was over 80% Black or Hispanic. Meanwhile, districts with over 70% white enrollment received an average increase of 11.8%. She turned a page, her fingertips deliberate, her gaze steady. This isn't a math error. This is policy. This is pattern. And it's paid for with opportunities stolen from children who don't look like most of us in this room. A few murmurs stirred, not loud, but enough to feel the temperature shift. In Florida alone, she continued, title and allocations dropped in 10 of the most underserved counties, all majority Black. Meanwhile, the interruption came fast, sharp, like the snap of a brittle branch under boot. We've had enough from loudmouth Democrats like you. Nancy Mace's voice didn't waver. It didn't rise in volume. It landed cold, clear, and calculated. A bullet disguised as a sentence. Everything stopped. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way that eyes froze, pens halted mid-stroke, and even the low hum of the air conditioning seemed to retreat. Jasmine didn't flinch, not immediately. Her hands stayed resting on her folder, her expression unchanged for half a second too long. But inside her chest, something sank, then locked into place. She slowly turned her head, eyes narrowing slightly as she fixed her stare on Nancy, unblinking, unreadable. I'm sorry, Jasmine said, her voice low and precise. What did you just say, Madam Chair? Her question wasn't theatrical. It wasn't defensive. It was clinical. She wanted the words repeated, not because she hadn't heard them, but because she wanted the country to hear them again, this time without doubt, without ambiguity. She wanted it on record. Nancy leaned back in her seat, lacing her fingers and offering a smirk that belonged more in a campaign ad than a hearing room. You heard me, Congresswoman, she said. Loudmouth. You people always turn these hearings into emotional soapboxes. Wear it proudly." A gasp rippled somewhere along the back row of aides. Someone's laptop snapped shut. On the high-mounted TV monitors, the CNN feed continued uninterrupted, broadcasting the moment coast to coast. There would be no walking it back, no misquoting, no plausible deniability. Jasmine didn't respond, not with words. Her silence was total, and in it was something unmistakable. Composure forged from too many moments, just like this one. She blinked once, her lips pressed together, not in retreat, but in refusal. She sat taller, hands folded calmly, refusing to give the room what it wanted. Rage, indignation, meltdown. Because that was the play. That was the setup. That line wasn't spontaneous. It was bait, designed for a viral clip, a talking point, a narrative. Loudmouth Democrat would be the Fox News Chiron by nightfall if she gave them the wrong 10 seconds. They wanted her to raise her voice, to reinforce the stereotype, to become the caricature they'd already written into the script. And so she did the most radical thing she could do. Nothing. The insult still hung in the air, like smoke from a fresh shot fired. But Jasmine didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't rise to meet it. Instead, she reached for something heavier than outrage: truth. Her voice didn't change. It didn't shake or rise. If anything, it became softer, more deliberate, as if what she was about to say couldn't afford to be rushed. "His name was Elijah Brooks," Jasmine began, her tone steady as stone. "He was 13 years old, 7th grade. He liked sneakers and comic books and science. But the thing teachers wrote about him most in his file was this: talks too much. That's all. Not violent, not disruptive, just loud. Too many questions, too many opinions, too curious." She paused, not for drama, but to let them feel the absurd weight of that sentence. He got written up 5 times in one semester. For speaking, for pushing back when something didn't make sense. There was no movement in the room, just the whir of a camera lens adjusting focus. Jasmine kept going, each word a quiet indictment. He once asked his teacher why they skipped over the part in the textbook about Jim Crow. She told him it wasn't on the test. He asked why the school didn't have Black History Month posters like the other schools in the district. He was told to focus on real academics. They called his mother, told her he was disrespectful. She asked them what he'd done. They said he'd raised his voice. She exhaled just once, not as a release, but as a reset. A month later, he was walking home from school. Hoodie up, backpack on. A robbery had occurred a few blocks away. The description was vague. Black male, teenager, dark clothes. They stopped him. He didn't run. He didn't yell. He just asked why. They said he resisted. They said he reached for something. They tackled him. His head hit the pavement. He was in a coma for 3 days. He died on the 4th. Now even the side conversations had stopped. Every aide had put their phones down. One congressional staffer swallowed hard. A veteran reporter near the exit lowered his eyes. But Jasmine wasn't telling this story for sympathy. She was telling it because this room needed to be reminded that numbers on paper meant lives in motion. His mother said she used to tell him, "Stop talking so much, Elijah. Stop questioning everything. People don't like loud boys." But he couldn't help it. That was who he was. Loud. Not rude. Not angry. Just loud. She let the word land without apology, without flinch. They called him a disruption. They made him feel like noise. But he was trying to be heard in a system built to ignore him. Then she looked up, eyes calm, voice even, but her presence commanding. He was loud too, but no one listened. A long pause. Just like today. The words didn't just fill the room, they broke it. Not with volume, but with weight. You could feel something shift, like the oxygen had changed. A stillness that wasn't scripted, a silence that no one quite knew how to step out of. Jasmine didn't need to explain the parallel. She didn't have to. The room understood. She'd been labeled loudmouth for daring to question, for refusing to fold into decorum that protected power more than people. Just like Elijah. And that's when it happened. Nancy Mace, still in the chairwoman's seat, still gripping her gavel like a prop. gave a short, sharp breath through her nose. Not a laugh exactly, but something uglier. A dismissive huff, a smirk pulling at the edge of her lips, as if she'd grown tired of the morality play. As if the story of a dead black child was just too inconvenient for the agenda of the day. She rolled her eyes just slightly, but the cameras caught it. Every one of them, in full high definition. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't react. But her stillness in that moment said everything. Because there are moments that don't need rebuttal. Moments when your silence becomes the indictment. When the cruelty of the other person reveals itself more clearly than your defense ever could. And while the room would eventually resume, while the hearing would stumble forward with more questions and more sound bites, that moment, that breathless crack in the mask, would remain. A single casual act of dismissal in the face of a child's death. And it would follow Nancy Mace longer than any vote she ever cast. The silence still hung in the air, like smoke after a strike. But Nancy didn't retreat. She struck harder, this time not with words, but with something colder, more calculated, a weaponized lie dressed as evidence. Nancy Mace tapped her screen with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. "Madam Clerk," she said, voice wrapped in false politeness, "please cue up Exhibit C." The room's lights dimmed slightly as the monitors on the chamber walls came alive. For a moment, static. Then, Jasmine Crockett's face. A younger version standing at a community forum, hand raised, passion in her eyes. But the audio was wrong, cut, distorted, engineered to accuse. "I don't pledge allegiance to a flag that doesn't protect my people." The clip played, ending abruptly. Another cut followed, this one even sharper. "When the police act like fascists, what do you expect me to call them? Heroes." The screen froze there, mid-sentence, mid-expression. Jasmine's face paused at an angle that made her look almost unhinged. The silence in the room was immediate, and then it broke. Not into conversation, but into reaction. Gasps. A low theatrical whistle from one of the Republican aides in the second row. A congressman leaned forward with both elbows on the table, shaking his head like a disappointed father. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable," just loud enough for a nearby mic to catch. Nancy Mace didn't need to say anything else. She leaned back in her chair, smug, and watched the oxygen drain from the room like a magician waiting for applause. And then the cameras moved. Like trained predators, they all swiveled to Jasmine. Not to Mace, not to the source of the clip, but to the woman in the crosshairs. Every lens locked on her face, hoping for the crack, the outrage, the snap. Because this was never about truth, it was about the reaction. And the narrative had been set before Jasmine even walked into the room. All that was left now was for her to prove it. But she didn't. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She didn't even blink. Because this wasn't the first time she'd watched her voice get stolen, spliced apart, rearranged like puzzle pieces meant to build a lie. She knew the full sentence. "I don't pledge blind allegiance to a flag that doesn't yet protect all of my people, but I believe in fighting to make it worthy of that pledge." That truth had been amputated, edited out. What remained was a soundbite made for smear ads and social media firestorms. The injustice didn't lie in what they showed. It lay in what they didn't. It was the surgical cruelty of omission. And the people in that room, they weren't shocked because they believed it. They were shocked because they wanted to. Jasmine's eyes scanned the panel slowly, taking in each face. Some looked down, some smirked. One Republican congresswoman pretended to shuffle papers, as if pretending not to witness was the same as not being complicit. Jasmine recognized every tactic, because none of this was about debate. It was about erasure, a performance meant to shrink her, to drown out a woman who had already been told 1,000 times in 1,000 ways that she was too much. But they had made a mistake, because this version of Jasmine, the one seated beneath that screen, surrounded by hostility and half-truths, wasn't built to shatter. She was built to absorb, to endure, and more importantly, to remember. The image still hung frozen behind her, a moment mutilated and repurposed, while the room waited for her to protest. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She requested justice. Her voice didn't rise, didn't waver. It didn't need to. The steel was in the restraint. "Madam Chair," Jasmine said, turning slightly to face Nancy Mace directly, "I formally request that the full, unedited video be played for the record." Her words were calm, but they carried the unmistakable weight of someone refusing to be buried by a lie. That clip was manipulated. It omits context. It misleads this committee, and it misrepresents both the facts and my character. She paused, let it sit. If this body claims to care about truth, then we should start by letting it speak in full. The room didn't breathe. Nancy Mace's lips curled into something between a smirk and a refusal. She didn't look at Jasmine. She looked past her, down at her folder, as if the request hadn't been made at all. Then, like someone swatting away a gnat, she replied, "The committee has already seen the relevant portion. We'll proceed." The dismissal was surgical, polished in tone but brutal in intent. Jasmine had laid down a demand for fairness, and it had been stepped over like a crack in the floor. That was the moment the injustice crystallized. Not just in what had been said, but in what had been refused. The right to context, the right to accuracy, the right to defend the truth in front of a nation watching live. It wasn't just disrespect. It was systemic choreography, rehearsed erasure disguised as official process. But Jasmine didn't push. She didn't beg. She just stared back at the chairwoman, the kind of stare that says, "I've survived worse than you hiding behind protocol." And then a voice, clear and unexpected, rose from the other end of the panel. "Madam Chair," said Representative Alan Whitaker, an older congressman unaffiliated with either political extreme, known more for paperwork than passion. He leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "In the interest of accuracy, and given the gravity of the implication made against the witness, I respectfully move that this committee recess for 10 minutes to allow a full review of the unedited recording." The sentence landed like a crack through glass. A shift rippled across the room, not seismic but unmistakable. Nancy blinked, her fingers tightening slightly around the base of her gavel. "There's no need for that," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier certainty. She added, "This isn't a courtroom." But the justification rang thin, defensive. The cameras had caught it, not just the denial, but the shift. The tension that followed wasn't chaos, it was clarity. That a neutral voice had spoken up made it harder to dismiss. That the request had come from someone who'd never sided with Jasmine before made it impossible to ignore. What Jasmine had been denied out of prejudice, another had demanded out of principle. It didn't repair the injustice, but it exposed it. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't gloat. She didn't even exhale. She simply adjusted her papers, eyes forward, posture composed. She had asked for one thing, truth. And when that door was slammed, she stood in the gap. Now someone else had cracked it open. The clock hadn't stopped. But now the next 10 minutes weren't just a pause. They were the calm before a reversal, a quiet countdown to what happens when the full story finally gets its turn. The gavel may have struck pause, but the damage had already been done. And Jasmine knew, if she didn't move quickly, the lie would calcify into history. As the room slowly emptied for the 10-minute recess, a swarm of reporters rushed out like bloodhounds catching a scent. Lawmakers filtered into side rooms, some chuckling, others whispering, but Jasmine remained seated. Her hands moved with a quiet confidence, not theatrical, just precise. From the leather pouch stitched into the back of her folder, she withdrew a black USB drive and slipped it into her laptop. The screen came alive with a full-length video, untouched, unedited, hers. Her voice rang out in its original clarity, unchopped, unpoisoned. "I don't pledge blind allegiance to a flag until it protects all of us equally, but I fight to make it worthy of that pledge." There it was, the full truth. The part they'd cut out because the truth didn't fit their narrative. She didn't smile. She didn't even blink. She fast-forwarded, marked exact timestamps. Her fingers moved fast, her expression unreadable. She wasn't watching the video. She was loading a weapon, a quiet one made of context and code. Beside her, the soft click of shoes against marble stopped at her table. A senior aide bent low, voice tight with urgency. "We analyzed the clip they played. It's worse than we thought." He handed her a printed spectrogram. lines of color mapping vocal frequency like a digital fingerprint. They ran your voice through compression, made you sound harsher. There's a waveform spike at 017, unnatural. They isolated a breath and boosted it to sound like you snapped. Jasmine took the page. Her eyes scanned it. Not once did her posture shift. "Is it enough to prove tampering?" she asked. The aide nodded. "It's definitive." She slid the paper beside her laptop, added the full clip onto a backup flash drive, and sealed it in a labeled envelope. "Get this to the committee clerk before the recess ends," she said. "No drama, just chain of custody." Every word measured. She wasn't angry, she was exact. She knew the game. If you sound outraged, they say you're unstable. If you stay calm, they say you're rehearsed. So instead, let the evidence speak. Outside the chamber, the narrative had already started to crack. A reporter from the Hill posted a screenshot of the video timeline, writing, "There's a hard jump at 14 seconds. Where's the rest of the clip?" MSNBC had begun scrolling a banner that read, "Edit or smear. Questions surround hearing footage." Twitter lit up with side-by-side comparisons. One labeled what they played, the other what she actually said. The momentum was shifting, fast. Not because Jasmine had shouted, but because she hadn't. She'd let them overplay their hand, and now the press could smell blood. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had been silenced mid-sentence. Now the nation was hearing her in full, because they'd tried to bury her truth and missed a corner sticking out. That's the thing about evidence. It doesn't go away when you lie about it. It waits. And Jasmine? She was done waiting. When the 10-minute recess ended, the lawmakers returned to their seats. But the silence that followed wasn't procedural. It was the quiet that comes when the air itself knows something irreversible is about to unfold. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of a room that no longer saw her as a target, but as a question it hadn't been prepared to answer. Her laptop was already connected to the committee display. The screen in the chamber blinked to life with a single frame. Her face, calm, mid-sentence. Not the distorted freeze frame that had been used against her earlier, but one rooted in clarity. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't preface. She simply looked up and spoke with quiet certainty. "Madam Chair, members of this committee, I request the following be entered into the record. The original, unedited footage you were not shown, and the technical breakdown confirming its manipulation." There were no objections this time. Permission wasn't granted so much as silently conceded. The room dimmed. The video began. Her voice filled the chamber. Not the clipped, hostile echo that had been weaponized earlier, but the full sentence, smooth and deliberate. "I don't pledge blind allegiance to a flag that doesn't yet protect all of us equally, but I believe in fighting to make it worthy of that pledge." There it was, the missing half, the heart of what had been hidden. Then the next section played, the part where she had been accused of calling police fascists. Only now the actual line rang out, firm, constitutional, impossible to twist. When law enforcement steps outside the Constitution, they must be held accountable. That isn't anti-police. That's pro-democracy. No anger, no disrespect, just truth, stripped of its armor by the edit, and now restored to full voice. The screen then split in two. On one side, the doctored version played again, the chopped phrases and flattened tone arranged like a trap. On the other, the original. Below them, Jasmine clicked once more and brought up a waveform analysis, the audio map glowing in lines of blue, red, and gold. She stepped slightly to the side, letting the evidence speak. "This spike," she said, pointing to a jagged red line, "was not my voice. It was digitally altered, compressed and elevated to heighten emotional tone. That is not an opinion. It is forensic fact. I have submitted the acoustic analysis, signed by 2 independent experts, to the clerk." She paused, letting her words settle like ash. What this committee was shown earlier was not just edited, it was engineered. A staffer shifted uncomfortably behind the dais. One Republican congressman cleared his throat but said nothing. The Democratic members sat frozen, some in disbelief, others in quiet rage. At the end of the row, Representative Whitaker, the moderate who had requested the recess, Watch Jasmine the way one watches a fire they didn't expect to grow this fast. But Nancy Mace said nothing. She didn't rebut. She didn't even raise her head. Her fingers drummed once against the polished desk, then stopped. No denial, no apology, just stillness. Jasmine turned back to face the full committee now. Her eyes didn't scan for support. She wasn't looking to be rescued. She was naming what they'd tried to erase. "This wasn't a mistake," she said, voice low but steady. "It was a decision. Someone chose to strip context from my words and feed it to the public as fact. Someone decided that integrity was less important than narrative, and someone hoped I wouldn't have the receipts." The silence was complete now, not out of shock, but out of recognition. The room knew. The cameras knew. The country would know within minutes. Jasmine stepped back from the mic, her hands still at her sides, her expression unchanged. But for the first time all morning, the power in the room had clearly, irrevocably shifted. Not because she raised her voice, but because she refused to let them define it for her. And behind her, the full video continued to play. Truth uninterrupted. The truth had already landed. Clean, undeniable, devastating. The doctored clip had been dismantled, the room silenced, and Jasmine's name restored. But for some, nothing stings like being exposed in front of a camera. And in that silence, Nancy Mace snapped. It began with a twitch, a shift in Nancy's fingers, drumming the desk harder than necessary. Her smile, forced in frozen moments earlier, now looked brittle, almost painful. As Jasmine stood at the center of the chamber, her facts laid bare and her evidence untouched, the chairwoman's restraint buckled under the weight of her own failure. The moment had slipped out of her hands and she knew it. "Enough," Nancy muttered, but the mic caught it. She didn't look up. She shuffled a paper she didn't need to read. And then, louder, sharper. "We've heard enough of this morality theater." Jasmine turned her head slightly, not dramatically, not with provocation, just enough to acknowledge what had been said, enough to signal, "You want to go on record? Go ahead." Nancy's voice cracked through the room before anyone could stop her. "You people always play the victim." The words landed like broken glass hurled against marble, jarring, sharp, impossible to pretend away. A few lawmakers visibly stiffened. An aide dropped their pen. Another leaned forward, brow creased, like they hadn't just heard what they'd heard. But Nancy wasn't done. The crack had widened. "Loudmouths, monkeys in suits." Silence. Not the ordinary kind, the kind that wraps a room in a second skin. A suffocating, freezing stillness that tells you history has just been made, and not the kind people will be proud of. It wasn't just the racism, it was the carelessness of it, the comfort, the fact that it hadn't slipped from her mouth in a moment of chaos, but had been sitting there, coiled like a snake waiting to strike. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't step back. She didn't shout. She didn't look at the cameras, though every lens had swung violently in her direction. She took a single breath. Then, without raising her voice, she said, "Say that again." For the record, it wasn't a request. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a command. The kind of sentence that echoes. The kind that demands accountability without theatrics. Every head turned to Mace. The temperature in the room dropped. Someone on the left side of the chamber muttered a curse under their breath. A Democratic congressman's mouth hung slightly open. A Republican woman on the committee pulled out her phone, not to scroll, but to start recording, because everyone in that room knew what had just happened. There are things you can walk back in Washington, a failed vote, a political flip-flop, even a lie if it's the right kind. But this wasn't spin. This was naked, and the woman who said it sat in the chair reserved for judgment. Jasmine stood perfectly still. Her hands rested gently on the table in front of her. Her shoulders didn't shift. Her eyes stayed locked on Nancy, not with rage, but with something deeper, clarity. And through that stillness, the truth radiated. This wasn't just a slip of the tongue. This wasn't about tension or pressure. This was the mask falling. Nancy's face went pale, then red, then pale again. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes darted to the press gallery, where every journalist was already mid-keystroke. Someone at CNN was pulling their earpiece out to scream into a producer's mic. Twitter had already caught fire. There would be transcripts. There would be footage. There would be no walking this one back. The room remained frozen. Jasmine didn't fill the silence. She didn't need to. Nancy had done all the talking, and the country had listened. What had started as a calculated effort to discredit Jasmine had become a case study in the very bias she had come here to fight. It was raw, it was exposed, and it was hers to hold, not as a burden, but as proof. Proof of what happens when you refuse to be quiet. Proof of what happens when you don't flinch, even as someone tries to reduce you, not with argument, but with dehumanization. And Jasmine Crockett, a woman accused all day of being too loud, had answered the loudest slur of them all with a whisper. Say it again, for the record. The power in that sentence wasn't just in the words. It was in the control, in the refusal to meet hate with hate, in the decision to let the silence speak louder than fury. Because what Jasmine knew, what the entire room now understood, is that there is no better witness than the moment someone shows you exactly who they are. And Nancy Mace had just sworn herself in. No rebuttal, no recovery, just the raw sound of a career cracking open beneath the weight of its own cruelty. And Jasmine, she stood untouched, not because she hadn't been hit, but because she'd been through worse, and they hadn't silenced her then either. Jasmine didn't need Nancy to repeat it. The room had heard it. The country had felt it. But what none of them realized yet, what Jasmine already suspected, was that every second had been caught on the room's hot mic. The moment stretched long, thick with unspoken tension. Then near the back of the chamber, a man stood up slowly. He wore no congressional pin. His badge read House Technical Support, and his hand trembled slightly as he raised it. Madam Chair, he said, voice taut, for the record, I must confirm that the microphones in this chamber remain active during all sessions unless manually deactivated. Nancy didn't react. She stared blankly ahead, as though the words hadn't registered. But Jasmine turned to the man, not with surprise, but with something closer to quiet affirmation. She'd felt it. Every fiber of her understood the system well enough to know it always leaves behind a trail. And this time, the wire hadn't gone dead. The tech continued, now reading from a device clutched to his chest. There's an onboard archival system that stores all live audio on a rolling buffer. The phrase in question, "You people always play the victim, monkeys in suits," was captured at timestamp 10:42:33. The room broke open with a low gasp, audible, measured, irrevocable. It was no longer a matter of denial or spin. It was on record. And Jasmine, still unmoved, turned slightly and said, "Then I move that the committee replay the archived audio for full verification." There was no vote. There didn't need to be. The room went dark for just a second, the screens reconfiguring. A faint buzz from the overhead speakers signaled the playback feed was live. Then it came, static, low at first, then Nancy's voice, crisp, unmistakable. "You people always play the victim." Click. Loudmouths. Click. Monkeys in suits. No edits. No debate. Just raw audio, playing back like a confession under fluorescent light. Nancy's head dropped into her hands. For a few seconds no one moved. No one exhaled. It wasn't outrage now. It was recognition. Recognition of the line that had been crossed. The kind that doesn't blur with party lines or clever talking points. The kind that echoes through institutions like a fracture in marble. Every person in that room knew it. This wasn't just offensive. It was historic, ugly, public. A rustle cut through the silence. It was Representative Valdez, a Democrat from California, standing and gathering his folder. "With respect, I refuse to sit at a table where that language is allowed to stand," he said. He turned, walked straight down the aisle, and left. His aide followed. Within seconds, others rose too. Representative Lamar from Massachusetts, then Rivers from Illinois. And to the quiet astonishment of half the chamber, Representative Dean, a moderate Republican from Pennsylvania, stood as well. "This goes beyond partisanship," he muttered. "This is rot." It didn't take long. The exodus wasn't dramatic. It was coordinated. A quiet, measured rejection that carried more weight than shouting ever could. One by one, members left their chairs empty, crossing behind Jasmine with silent nods, acknowledging not just her composure, but the fact that she had stood her ground while the system cracked around her. Nancy still hadn't moved. Her knuckles were white on the desk. The gavel lay untouched beside her, useless now. She had no command left, only eyes on her, millions of them, from the press gallery, from the live stream, from social media feeds already catching fire. On screen, a trending bar climbed upward like a rocket. Resign Mace. Then say it again. Then monkeys in suits. It was over. Not in the legal sense, not yet. But in the moral court of public consciousness, the verdict had been delivered. Jasmine remained seated. She hadn't needed to shout, hadn't needed to grandstand. She had simply held the line and let the truth arrive on its own frequency. Now that it had, she didn't feel victorious. She felt exhausted, not visibly, not in posture, but somewhere deeper, beneath the practiced control that every Black woman in power learns to armor herself with. And then came the final blow. A page walked swiftly into the room, delivering a folded memo directly to the clerk. It bore the seal of the Speaker of the House. The clerk read it, eyes widening, and turned to the committee mic. This hearing is suspended, effective immediately. The office of the Speaker has requested a formal review of Chairwoman Mace's conduct. The room tensed, but only briefly. It wasn't shock anymore. It was inevitability. Nancy finally raised her head. Her eyes were glassy, not from regret, but from the realization that there would be no cleanup, no clever press release, no panel of allies spinning this into a misunderstanding. What she'd said, what she chose to say, was now part of the congressional record, a stain on more than just her name. It would follow her across every screen, every newsroom, every whispered hallway conversation for the rest of her political life. And Jasmine? She stood, not rushed, not theatrical. She gathered her notes with care, slid the USB back into its pouch, and turned to leave. But as she passed the witness table, she paused, looked at the chair, at Nancy, and said only this. "You didn't just insult me, you confirmed why I'm here." Then she walked out. Behind her, the room remained frozen, one woman carrying the weight of truth, and another crumbling beneath the weight of her own words. As Jasmine stepped past the stunned faces and into the corridor, the chamber behind her still trembling from the impact of truth, one final figure entered, unannounced, unhurried, and carrying the full weight of institutional reckoning. The double doors creaked open, not with drama, but with finality, the kind of hush that falls when the last person with real authority enters the room. It was Chairman Bradford Ellis, veteran congressman, long respected for his neutrality and rarely seen outside of his usual committee circuit. His arrival was not scheduled. It wasn't expected, which made it all the more devastating. He walked in slowly, eyes sharp beneath silver brows, and paused just inside the chamber. No aides flanked him. No press knew he was coming. He stood for a full breath, surveying what remained, a committee room half empty, a dais chairwoman reduced to silence, and a floor that still echoed with the fallout of her words. Then he moved. With deliberate steps, he crossed to the center, bypassing formalities, microphones, and any illusion of routine. "This committee," he said without raising his voice, "is now under interim oversight." His tone cut clean, like polished marble cracking. Effective immediately, Chairwoman Nancy Mace's authority to preside over this hearing is suspended pending formal review by the Ethics Committee. Nancy didn't look up. The words landed like a verdict without a jury. No one in the room spoke. Even the stenographer stopped typing, fingers hovering over keys as if unsure whether to mark the moment or leave it untouched. Chairman Ellis nodded once toward the clerk, who solemnly closed the session folder in front of her. "I will assume facilitation of remaining proceedings," he added, "and I will allow one final statement, should the witness wish to speak." The cameras flicked back on with a soft, mechanical whir. Microphones lit green again. But the moment wasn't about technology. It was about choice, about whether Jasmine Crockett, after everything, still had something left to say. She did. Jasmine turned just slightly from her place near the exit. She stepped back toward the table. Not because she needed a stage, but because she understood the weight of endings, of leaving something not just finished, but understood. She stood behind the microphone, no papers in hand, no notes to reference. Just the moment. Just the truth. When I walked into this room, she began, her voice calm and steady, I knew the odds. I knew the narrative that would be waiting for me. Angry, emotional, loud. She paused, not for effect, but for gravity. And I knew there would be some who would rather cut my words than confront them, who would distort my voice because they couldn't dismiss what it was saying. She looked straight ahead, not at Mace, not at the cameras, but at the seats themselves, at the institution. But let me make something clear, she said, her voice rising, not in volume, but in clarity. You didn't hear me speak loudly today because I'm unruly, or unprofessional, or playing some part. You heard me speak clearly because silence has never saved people like me, and I didn't come here to be palatable. I came here to be truthful. Behind her, the full transcript of the doctored clip and the waveform analysis had been projected onto the side screen. A few remaining staffers glanced up at it, faces tense. She continued. You called me loud, Jasmine said, her tone now firmer, her stance square. You called me theatrical. You tried to paint my voice as a weapon instead of a warning. But the only thing I've ever raised is the volume of truth in rooms that would rather hear echoes. Then she paused, just long enough to let the weight settle. You called me loud. I call it not being silent anymore. And that was it. She didn't linger. She didn't look to the chairman for approval. She simply stepped back, unplugged her laptop, and tucked the folder of evidence, now stained by the weight of history, under her arm. No one moved. No one tried to clap. Because applause would have cheapened it. This wasn't victory. It was exposure. It was what justice sounds like when it finally finds a mic and refuses to hand it back. Chairman Ellis bowed his head once in acknowledgement. Not approval, not admiration, just recognition of the line that had been crossed, and the woman who had crossed it standing. As Jasmine Crockett exited room 226 for the final time that day, the silence that followed was not the silence of defeat. It was the kind that remains when something irreversible has been said out loud, and no one can unhear it. Behind her, on the committee monitors, the last line of the closed caption transcript still glowed. You called me loud. I call it not being silent anymore. No one turned the screen off. They let it stay, let it burn, let it echo, because they all knew. History doesn't whisper when it walks out the door. It leaves the door open. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped off the Capitol steps and into the overcast afternoon, the world outside the hearing room had already changed, and it hadn't waited for permission. The news alerts came fast. At 3:47 p.m., the Washington Post updated their headline from Crockett accused of anti-American remarks to unedited footage reveals edited smear against Representative Crockett. At 3:52, MSNBC ran a breaking banner. Crockett clip was doctored. Ethics panel reviews Chairwoman Mace's conduct. By 4:05 p.m., CNN anchor Dana Reese opened her live broadcast with a tone rarely heard from her, measured but reverent. What began as an attempt to discredit a congresswoman ended with a moment that has now been described as one of the most dignified and devastating rebuttals ever caught live on Capitol Hill. It wasn't spin, it wasn't damage control, it was the oxygen of a new narrative catching fire. Clips of Jasmine's closing words flooded every platform. On Twitter, her line, "You called me loud. I call it not being silent anymore," was captioned, stitched, and quote tweeted by journalists, celebrities, veterans, teachers, teenagers. Side-by-side edits of Jasmine's calm against Nancy Mace's eruption turned into 10-second TikToks that played like courtroom dramas. But this wasn't fiction. This was real. And people didn't just watch it. They felt it. By sundown, a new hashtag emerged. Loud for Justice. It wasn't just a slogan. It was a declaration, a reclamation. It started when a 15-year-old high schooler from Atlanta posted a 30-second video on TikTok. She stood in her school bathroom, uniform slightly wrinkled, her phone propped up on a folded paper towel. She spoke into the lens with a trembling voice that didn't quite crack. I used to be afraid to raise my hand. I was afraid they'd say I was too loud, too much. But today I saw someone who looked like me not back down. Now I speak louder. Thanks, Representative. Crockett. Within an hour, her video had 4.2 million views. By morning, it had 12.8. Teachers began using the footage in classrooms, not as a civics lesson, but as a case study in dignity. University students played Jasmine's words over protest montages. A law school professor at Howard uploaded a thread breaking down Jasmine's composure as a masterclass in strategic restraint under racial pressure. Hashtags gave way to headlines, and headlines gave way to history. One op-ed in The Atlantic read, "In one of the most hostile environments a black woman can enter, a live congressional hearing, Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive a racialized ambush, she transformed it into an indictment of the culture that built the ambush in the first place." But the most powerful shift wasn't on television, it was in absence. By the second evening, Nancy Mace's press team canceled all scheduled appearances. No statement, no press release, not even a denial. The Twitter account that once fired out policy barbs every 30 minutes went dark. News outlets requested interviews. None were granted. Fox News, where she had once been a regular fixture, refused to comment on whether she'd return. Her office door, usually wide open for cameras, remained shut. And for the first time since she'd entered Congress, Nancy Mace had gone silent. The irony was so sharp it barely needed to be said. The woman who had mocked another for speaking, who had laughed at her voice, cut her mic, twisted her words, and labeled her a loudmouth, was now hiding behind the very silence she once demanded from someone else. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett didn't host a press conference. She didn't go on morning shows. She didn't write a victory tweet. She just went back to her office, answered constituent letters, and met with an education equity group from Detroit. When asked by reporters if she planned to take further action against Mace, she offered only a short reply. "Justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it just looks like exposure." And that was the final blow. Because what Nancy Mace had tried to do wasn't just political, it was structural. It was the slow, strategic unraveling of someone's credibility based on tone, volume, identity. And Jasmine had responded not with outrage, but with evidence, with patience, with composure. And in doing so, she'd pulled back the curtain not just on a woman, but on a machine. By day 3, a special ethics panel had been convened. By day 5, the New York Times editorial board called for Mace's resignation. Her language, her manipulation of evidence, and her refusal to apologize make her position as committee chair untenable. And yet Jasmine Crockett remained largely out of sight, because she didn't need to speak anymore. The country was speaking for her. At rallies in St. Louis, Los Angeles, and Baltimore, crowds held up signs that read, "Loud isn't rude, loud is resistance." She spoke for me. #Loud for justice. And in Washington, a plaque was quietly requested by staff to be placed in Committee Room 226. Just 6 words engraved on polished brass. "You called me loud. I called it justice." No ceremony, no unveiling, just truth. Left there to echo, long after the shouting stopped. It didn't end when Jasmine Crockett walked out of the hearing room. In fact, that's when it really began. The clip of her final words had already traveled through 1,000 timelines and inboxes before she reached her car. By the next morning, it was being broadcast not just on political talk shows, but across classrooms, community centers, and living rooms where justice had long been a distant headline. For millions of Americans, it wasn't just that Jasmine had spoken, it was how she spoke, with restraint, with control, with fire wrapped in dignity, and without giving them what they wanted, a black woman shouting, unraveling, giving them something easy to dismiss. In Harlem, a group of high school seniors paused their standardized test prep to discuss her words instead. One teacher put down the math workbook and played the full exchange on a projector. When it ended, a student raised his hand and said, "She sounded like my mom when she's had enough, but won't let them see her sweat." Everyone in the room nodded. They knew that tone. It wasn't just rhetoric. It was survival strategy turned into public art. In Oakland, a muralist painted Jasmine's silhouette towering over a city skyline, one hand raised not in anger, but in assertion. Across her shoulder read the words, Loud is when truth refuses to whisper. On the Senate floor, two members, one Democrat, one independent, publicly cited her moment as a model of constitutional courage under racial pressure. For a place notorious for posturing and doublespeak, their praise was almost intimate. It wasn't just about her performance. It was about the tectonic truth it forced the country to confront. But it wasn't only adults watching. A 15-year-old girl in Atlanta filmed a TikTok from her school bathroom. The tiles dull, the lighting harsh, the message unforgettable. Her voice trembled as she stared into the camera and said, "I used to be afraid to raise my hand. I was scared they'd say I was too loud, too dramatic, too black. But after yesterday, I'm done whispering. Thanks, Representative Crockett." She hit upload. 12 hours later, the video had 6 million views. Teachers stitched it. Authors reshared it. By the end of the week, it was being played at youth summits, college forums, and Sunday services across the South. The hashtag that had started as a flicker, #Loud for Justice, now roared. It climbed to the top of global trends within 48 hours, not as an algorithm trick, but as an anthem. People weren't just reposting Jasmine's video. They were adding their own voices. A nurse in Detroit uploaded a video saying, "They called me too aggressive for asking for pain meds for my patient, but now I'm loud for justice." A bus driver in Baltimore stood in front of her rearview mirror and whispered, "I speak now. I'm loud now. I'm not sorry anymore." It wasn't a movement built on slogans. It was built on relief that someone had finally named the manipulation out loud and done it on live television in front of the very people who usually got to edit the story. Jasmine hadn't just won a moment. She had restored ownership to a voice that had been twisted, softened, erased for centuries. But perhaps the most powerful echo came from those who never planned to speak at all. In Houston, a 64-year-old grandmother named Clarice Campbell recorded her very first social media post. Sitting at her kitchen table, holding her rosary, she looked straight into the lens and said, "I marched in 1968. I saw us fight for the right to vote, to speak, to sit at the table. But today I saw something new. I saw my granddaughter's eyes light up. She said, 'She talks like you, Nana.' And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel tired. I felt heard." What Jasmine had done wasn't explosive. It was enduring. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't stormed out. She hadn't flipped the table. She'd stood still. Let the facts speak. Let the system indict itself. And in doing so, she gave people something most of them didn't even realize they were starving for. An example. An example that you can be both angry and elegant. That you can be wounded and still wield truth like a weapon. That you don't need to raise your voice to make the room shake. And that when someone tells you to be silent, the most radical thing you can do is keep speaking anyway. The hearing room was now quiet. The chair where Nancy Mace once presided sat empty. Her name hadn't been mentioned in over a week. And that too was fitting. Because the woman who once demanded that Jasmine be silent had now vanished into the very quiet she once used as a weapon. And Jasmine, she hadn't disappeared. She hadn't gloated. She hadn't needed to. Because the echo didn't come from her mouth anymore. It was coming from everywhere else. The cameras eventually turned away. The headlines moved on as they always do, replaced by new chaos and another scandal, louder fireworks. The story that had once gripped the nation faded from the front pages, but not from the people who'd felt it, because something stayed. Weeks after the hearing, when the frenzy had cooled and Capitol Hill returned to its usual rhythm of noise and forgetting, Jasmine Crockett didn't chase the spotlight. She didn't book a press tour. She didn't write a memoir. She did what she'd always done, returned to her district, returned to the people who sent her there in the first place. But something was different now. At her first town hall back in Dallas, the line wrapped around the building, not for handshakes, not for selfies, but to speak. Elderly veterans in pressed suits, teenagers with notebooks, young mothers balancing babies on their hips. They came not to ask her questions, but to tell her what her silence in that hearing had said to them. "You didn't yell," one young woman said, voice shaking as she stood up in the back row. And still the room broke apart. A teacher nodded beside her. "You didn't match her hate. You made it undeniable. A man in his 70s, civil rights era, eyes heavy with memory, took Jasmine's hand afterward and whispered, "You didn't just hold your ground. You changed the shape of it." Outside the media machine, where narratives are spun and unspun daily, something else had begun to form. Quiet, steady, real. A legacy. At Howard University, a constitutional law professor began assigning Jasmine's hearing testimony as required reading. Not for her policy points, but for her discipline, her poise under pressure, her refusal to let a room built to erase her define her. In a classroom full of black women studying law, the professor played the moment Jasmine said, "Say that again, for the record," and paused the video. "That," she said, "is what power sounds like when it isn't begging for permission." At Spelman, a graduate writing seminar hosted a panel called Voices That Refuse to Flinch. One of the speakers, a poet and activist, called Jasmine's restraint a form of resistance most people are too wounded to sustain, but she carried it like a blade wrapped in grace. But it wasn't just academia. In neighborhoods far from Capitol microphones, her name had become shorthand for standing firm. A middle school girl in Detroit, bullied for talking back in class, wrote in her journal, "I'm not rude, I'm just not small. I'm like her. I'm loud for justice." Her teacher found the note. She had it laminated. The reverberations weren't loud. They were deep. They moved not through media, but through memory, through the quiet moments where dignity is hardest to hold. Job interviews, parent-teacher conferences, courtroom benches. In those moments, Jasmine Crockett had become a reference point, a permission slip, a reminder that not shrinking isn't arrogance, it's survival. And Jasmine, she never pretended it didn't cost her something. In an interview weeks later, her first since the hearing, she sat across from a reporter who tried to get her to celebrate. "You've been called the embodiment of grace under fire," the journalist said. "Do you see it that way?" Jasmine smiled, but her eyes stayed still. "I wasn't trying to be graceful," she said. "I was trying not to give them a reason to erase me." She paused, then added, "The real story isn't that I kept my composure. The real story is why I had to." That quote made it into every major paper the next morning. But Jasmine didn't care, because for her, this was never about image. It was about space. Who gets to speak? Who gets believed? Who gets buried when the mic cuts off? And who refuses to let that silence win? And so she kept showing up, not louder, just unwavering, just present, because her voice didn't need to dominate every room anymore. It had already been heard, and more importantly, it had given others permission to speak their own. In the foyer of her district office, a new display had been quietly installed. Just one quote, framed above a waveform of the moment her voice was cut and then reclaimed. "I wasn't loud. You were just too used to me being silent." No plaque, no ribbon cutting, just the truth, left on the wall, where it would stay. But the legacy of that hearing wasn't just about headlines, hashtags, or even policy. It was about something quieter, deeper, and far more enduring. The human cost of being unheard and the power of refusing to stay that way. The lesson didn't come wrapped in applause. It came in the way Jasmine Crockett had to measure every breath she took behind a microphone that had already been tuned to distort her. It came in the way her voice was pre-labeled, too loud, too angry, too much, before she even opened her mouth. It came in the unspoken truth that her composure was never an accident, but a necessity. In a room built to shame her, she was expected not only to speak, but to survive the consequences of being heard. That isn't equality. That's a performance under pressure that most people never have to give. And yet, she gave it, because the deeper injustice wasn't just that Nancy Mace insulted her. It was that the room didn't collapse when it happened. It was that the moment wasn't shocking to many, it was familiar. For every woman of color who had ever been silenced in a boardroom, ignored in a courtroom, or punished in a classroom for tone rather than substance, this was not a unique wound. It was a mirror. A national reflection of the quiet violence woven into so-called professional spaces. And Jasmine's greatest act of rebellion? She didn't break. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't match insult with insult. Instead, she stood still while the system cracked open around her and asked one unflinching question. Say that again. For the record. In that moment, she forced the room to look at itself. No escape, no spin, no disassociation. She turned the table without flipping it. And that's what made it impossible to ignore, because she didn't fit the stereotype they'd prepared for. She refused to play the part they had written in advance. She didn't come to make noise. She came to make history. And through her restraint, she taught the rest of us something we rarely want to admit. That sometimes the most radical act in the face of injustice is not becoming the thing they expect you to be. The moral lesson here is not that Jasmine Crockett handled it well. That praise is too small for what she endured. The lesson is that no one should ever have to weaponize their own self-control in order to survive a space built for public service. The lesson is that racism, when disguised as professionalism, is no less violent. And that silence, when imposed on the marginalized, isn't neutrality, it's a muzzle. But Jasmine turned that muzzle into a mic, and she did so knowing the risks, that even a perfectly calm voice from a black woman can be twisted into a threat, that even undeniable evidence can be spun, that even in truth, she might not be protected. And still, she chose to speak. She chose not to dilute her presence, not to shrink to make others comfortable. And by doing so, she gave everyone watching something we're starved for in this country. A new model of strength. A strength that doesn't need volume to shake a room. A strength that knows the power of stillness, the discipline of holding your fire when the world hands you a match and begs for flames. A strength that doesn't prove itself through dominance, but through resistance to dehumanization. That is the lesson she left behind. Not just for black women, not just for politicians, but for all of us. For every person who's ever been talked over, dismissed, underestimated, or told to be quiet and wait your turn, Jasmine didn't just represent you. She reminded you that you never needed permission in the first place. She reminded you that truth doesn't have to shout to be heard. But when it does shout, when it must, it has every right to. Because this world doesn't change through politeness. It changes through courage disguised as grace, through accountability demanded without apology, through standing up, not just for yourself, but for the ones still afraid to. And if there's one moment, one phrase, one breath we take from what Jasmine gave us that day, it should be this. You called me loud. I call it not being silent anymore. That's not a comeback. That's a blueprint. And it's up to the rest of us to carry it forward. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.